Hello, welcome back. We're going to talk about gas exchange now. And so we're talking about both the movement of gases between the blood and the lungs, so in the alveoli, and in the system between the blood and the systemic cells. Okay? So to do so, there we go, we have to talk about a couple other gas laws. So we've already talked about Boyle's law. Now we're going to talk about Dalton's law, and then we're going to talk about Henry's law. So in Dalton's law states that the partial pressure of a gas, of a complete gas, is going to be the individual pressures of each individual gas within the mixture added up. And so when you look at atmospheric pressure, there's a lot of different gases associated with it. So we have nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and some other things within the atmosphere. The total pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. But if you look, the majority of the pressure comes from nitrogen. So nitrogen has or takes up about 78.6% of the gas in the air. And so when you take 760 millimeters of mercury times 78.6, you get 597 millimeters of mercury for the partial pressure of nitrogen in the air. And so we don't breathe in air, or no, that sounds silly. We don't breathe in nitrogen typically, right? We don't take nitrogen into our blood. We take in oxygen. And so here we have the partial pressure of oxygen. Oxygen, it makes up only about 21% of the air. And so that is going to be so we have a much lower partial pressure for oxygen, but that's what's going to go into our blood. And so here you can see the different partial pressures of oxygen, nitrogen, and the mixture. So the remaining is going to be the water vapors or carbon dioxide or other materials that are in the air. Come on, there we go. But like I said, we don't take nitrogen into our blood in general. This is because there's also the ability to dissolve in fluids that has to be associated with movement of materials. And so Henry's law gives us a solubility coefficient. So at any given volume of gas, it's going to dissolve in a specific volume of liquid at a given temperature. And so that constant that occurs is known as the solubility coefficient. So nitrogen is not very soluble, so it cannot move into our blood very effectively. But carbon dioxide is super soluble, so it moves into our blood really easily. Oxygen is twice as soluble as nitrogen, and so it's going to move into our blood much more effectively than nitrogen will. And so this is important because if we change the pressure, because it's all about pressure, at any given pressure and temperature, the solubility of a gas or the ability of a gas to dissolve will be determined, right, and give you that solubility coefficient. So at any given pressure, or no, if the pressure increases, even though nitrogen has a low solubility coefficient, it's going to become more likely to dissolve. And so if you go diving, that actually increases the pressure, and that can make nitrogen be able to dissolve and move into your blood. If you move very high up in the atmosphere, then even oxygen is not going to be able to get into your blood as effectively. And so in both cases, you need to be able to gain the nutrients you need. And so these can lead you to different disorders. So acute mountain sickness occurs when individuals increase in altitudes above or at 2,400 meters. And so this decreases the pressure so much that oxygen can't dissolve as effectively and can't move into our lungs. The pressure has changed and the oxygen's ability to dissolve has changed. And so there are different mechanisms that come into play with those lower or higher altitude environments. If you live in an environment that is super high, then you will have certain adaptations that will occur, like you'll increase in the amount of blood production so that you can pick up more oxygen. But if you are climbing a mountain, so typically when we think of mountain sickness or altitude sickness, it's because you went to an environment that is very has a high altitude. If you have supplemental oxygen, if you increase your hydration, those are going to help you as well. And so here we can show you some areas that have a very high altitude. So New York is at like ground zero, basically. You can think of it that way. So altitude is 760 millimeters of mercury. And so we have 159 millimeters of mercury for oxygen's partial pressure. But as we increase in altitude, we lower the partial pressure, and that lowers the pressure of oxygen. And that means it's not going to be as dissolvable, and it's going to be harder to get into your lungs. Here's Aspen, Colorado, Pikes Peak, Denali, and Mount Everest. So the partial pressure keeps dropping, and that's going to make it really hard to pull the oxygen in, and that's where you're going to need to have the supplemental oxygen. There's another disorder with increased pressure, and that's called decompression sickness. So this occurs when divers are submerged in water for a certain amount of time and at a certain depth, and then they come up too quickly. Reasons for coming up too quickly typically are associated with being newer at diving, but another reason could be because you've lost your ability, you've lost your oxygen. Something happened to the tank or something that could cause problems. So that's why they always tell you to travel with a partner when you are diving. For every 10 meters down that you go in the water, you increase the pressure by about 12 pounds. And so that's going to make nitrogen be able to get into your blood easier and easier. And that leads to decompression sickness. So if you come up too fast, nitrogen will start bubbling out of your blood, and it can burst your blood vessels, damage your tissues. It'll cause bruising. It can lead to death. And so treatment is typically a decompression chamber and oxygen therapy. And so this is just a cute little, when Chuck Norris is scuba diving and surfaces too fast, the ocean gets the bends. Ha ha ha. For those of you who are Chuck Norris fans. And so this is a hyperbaric oxygen chamber that they can use to help control the amount of oxygen and the pressure inside. So the next part we're going to talk about is how oxygen and how carbon dioxide do travel in our blood. So we talked about oxygen, partial pressure, and how it moves across the plasma membrane and into our blood, or moves across the plasma membrane and into our lungs, and into our tissues, I'm sorry. And we also talked about how carbon dioxide does the opposite effect, right? So now we're going to talk about how oxygen actually travels. So the majority of oxygen that enters our blood is going to travel on inside the erythrocytes on the hemoglobin molecule, okay? So it binds to a portion of the hemoglobin called the heme. Whereas carbon dioxide, most of carbon dioxide travels outside of the blood and in blood plasma as bicarbonate ion. So very little actually binds to the hemoglobin molecule at all. When carbon dioxide enters the blood, it's going to actually immediately be converted into a carbonic acid molecule, which then dissociates into a bicarbonate ion and a hydrogen ion. The hydrogen ion will bind to the globin portion of the hemoglobin, and then the bicarbonate leaves and enters the plasma. When this happens, and so I'm showing you at the lungs only, when this happens, chloride is going to have to be moving because, so here's a bicarbonate ion and here we have a chloride. So chloride is going to move in the opposite direction of the bicarbonate ion to maintain the ion gradients, okay? And here you can see it again. This is just in the opposite side, carbon dioxide coming in. This is what I was kind of talking about. Carbon dioxide binds with water, producing carbonic acid, which then dissociates into a bicarbonate ion and a hydrogen ion. The hydrogen ion is going to bind to the globin portion. The bicarbonate leaves, and when bicarbonate goes into the blood plasma, chloride moves into the blood cell. When this happens, that binding of the hydrogen ion actually changes the conformation of the hemoglobin molecule, and that's what allows oxygen to leave. So oxygen unbinds, becomes less, has less of an affinity to the heme portion now, unbinds, and then it can move down its concentration gradient into our cells. So here we have carbon dioxide moving into the blood, and here you can see that carbonic acid being formed, bicarbonate and hydrogen. Hydrogen binds to the globin portion, bicarbonate leaves, and chloride moves in, okay? And then the opposite will happen in the lungs then. Okay. So oxygen binds to the iron. Carbon dioxide, when it does bind, binds to the globin portion, but most of the time it is going to dissociate into, it's going to bind or mix with water and dissociate into a bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion, and the hydrogen ion will also bind to the globin portion. And that binding changes the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen, allowing oxygen to be released. And so we have external respiration occurs in the respiratory, or occurs, not the respiratory, in the lungs, where we have carbon dioxide leaving the lungs, or yeah, leaving the blood and entering the lungs, and we have oxygen leaving the lungs and entering the blood. And then in the tissues, we have the opposite happening. So in the tissues, oxygen leaves the blood and moves into the tissues, and carbon dioxide leaves the tissues and moves into the blood. I'm going to stop here. Hold on. Psych, I'm not going to stop here. I've only got like 5 slides left, so I'm going to quickly finish this up, and we're going to talk about fetal hemoglobin. So fetal hemoglobin has a much higher affinity for oxygen than adult hemoglobin does. And so this fetal hemoglobin is similar in structure, but it has 2 different protein structures associated with it. And so oxygen is going to move from mom's hemoglobin to the fetal hemoglobin. When babies are born, then they have to break down, because immediately they're going to start producing adult hemoglobin, the normal hemoglobin. And because they're breathing, they're getting oxygen from their lungs now. And so they have to break down all that fetal hemoglobin. And when fetal hemoglobin gets broken down, it releases bilirubin. And bilirubin then can lead to jaundice if the liver is not able to take or break down the hemoglobin properly or effectively. And so bilirubin isn't so jaundice isn't a serious problem in general in infants. Most of the time they will use like a phototherapy, or they'll tell you to put your child in front of the or in direct sunlight for a few minutes each day, and that will help the baby's body to be able to break down the tissue or the hemoglobin that they need to break down. And so jaundice basically is this like darker yellowish color, this tinge, and then once they have gotten over the jaundice, then they have that normal coloration. So at about week 4 in development, the respiratory system starts forming. So if you remember, so we haven't talked about reproduction yet, so you can't remember this because I haven't told you this yet, but at the end of week 3, the beginning of week 4, we now are considered an embryo, and between week 4 and 8, we form all the structures of the body. We start the formation of all those structures. So the respiratory system starts forming from the endoderm, and so by the end of week 8, we're going to have a partially structured respiratory system already. So here's at week 8, we already have lungs formed. We have 3 lobes of a lung. We have the trachea. We have bronchi. We already have what will become alveolar sacs at the end of these bronchi. So the bronchi continue to branch from week 7 to 16. And it doesn't show. I don't have pictures of that. I apologize. And then from 16 to 24, we start producing those alveoli. And so prior to week 20, there would be no ability really for, well, prior to week 20, I don't think they can sustain life. Once you hit week 20, the baby has started producing a little bit of surfactant. And so from week 20 on, you have a much better chance of survival if you have a premature baby, but it's even better if you make it all the way to week 26. So a disorder associated, which I've already talked about, but associated with prematurely born infants is respiratory distress syndrome. And so this is seen in about 50% of cases of infants born between 26 and 28 weeks. If the baby makes it to 30 weeks, then only about 30% of the infants will actually have this disorder. And if they get up to 36 weeks, usually they can survive and don't have any problems without, they don't have many problems. I gave birth to a child at 34 weeks and she was fine. Respiratory distress sickness occurs because the lungs aren't able there. So do you see how the lungs are open here? That's what we want to see. In respiratory distress, the lungs are collapsed still because there's not enough surfactant to keep those alveoli opened. So they're they're basically collapsed and you can't get air in. And so treatment for respiratory distress syndrome is going to be anywhere from receiving pulmonary surfactant, pharmaceutical pulmonary surfactant, being put on a respirator or a mechanical ventilator to breathe for you, a CPAP machine, steroids. Those are all things that they might do to help with respiratory distress syndrome. And then these are two different infants, and you can read their stories if you'd like to. So we have finally finished chapter 22. And so I thought this was a perfect little meme. Breathe easy. Inhale through the nose, exhale slowly through the mouth, because you are done. So enjoy the rest of your day, and I will be posting these shortly on Edpuzzle. Bye.